Joining me today on the Capital TV show, Mr. Dennis Ross. He's a well-known diplomat and author. He has served as a director of policy planning in the State Department under President George Bush, and special Middle East coordinator under President Bill Clinton, and a special advisor for the Arab and Southern Asia to the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Mr. Ross, you almost no need introduction. You are most welcome. And let me start by talking on your book with David Macaulay, titled Be Strong and of Good Courage. Can you tell us more about these four leaders in Israel that until now, you are in Israel, that are based on their story, on their guidance for anything to be done?
Yes. These were four leaders who were very different ideologically. You're looking at David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon, and Yitzhak Rabin. And as I said, they were very different ideologically, but they understood the requirements of leadership much the same way. They understood their responsibility was to make decisions, not avoid them. They understood their responsibility was to lead their public, not to follow their public. They understood that oftentimes it meant taking on their own political base. Even if it was going to be unpopular, they felt you had to do what was important for the state. In other words, they put the state first and not their politics first. And the whole purpose of writing this book was to point out that in Israel, there are some difficult decisions that are going to have to be made to ensure that Israel doesn't drift into becoming one state for two people and maintains its character as a Jewish democratic state.
What kind of decisions are you talking about?
So the essence of the decisions they're going to have to make, that Israel's leaders need to make, if they continue to build to the east the security barrier, you're going to find it increasingly difficult to separate Israelis from Palestinians. And when you get to the point where you can't separate Israelis from Palestinians, you'll have one state for two peoples, as opposed to two states for two peoples. Now, when I say to the east the security barrier exists on the 8% of the territory closest to the Green Line. Now, it happens that 85% of all the Israeli settlers who live beyond the Green Line live within that 8%. 15% of the settlers live on the 92% that's to the east of the security barrier. If you continue to build to the east of the security barrier, as I said, sooner or later, you're going to find it very difficult to separate Israelis from Palestinians.
So you
separate, then you have one state.
Yeah, so Mr. Ross, you still believe in the process of two states? And how do you think Biden what do you think the plan of Biden administration concerning that subject?
Yes, I do, because one state is a prescription for an enduring conflict. Look around the Middle East, wherever you have a state where there is more than one national identity, sectarian identity, tribal identity, that's a state that's either at war with itself or completely paralyzed. That's not a future we should want for Israelis and Palestinians.
Okay.
Now, as for the Biden administration, I think they're committed to a two-state outcome, but we clearly see that it's not a high priority for them, to be fair, because they see very little likelihood that you can move and you can produce two states anytime soon. The politics in Israel, given this Israeli government, it's an interesting government in the sense that every ideological viewpoint perspective is in it, but it doesn't agree on what the outcome with Palestinians should be. On the Palestinian side, they're completely divided, not just geographically, but between Fatah and Hamas. And you haven't had an election since 2005 or 2006. There's no real legitimacy as a result. Hamas talks about elections, but has no interest in actually holding a real free and fair one. So the politics on each side make it difficult to resolve this. The question is, that can't be an argument for doing nothing.
You said also Don Shapiro's appointment to the administration's Iran team is a very smart move. It also shows that the administration is very serious about coordinating with the Israelis. That too sends an interesting signal. But as you are saying, it's not enough.
Well, I think, first of all, his appointment seems to relate more to the Iran issue than to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, number one. And number two, the administration has to decide how much is it prepared to invest in an effort to try to build and change the circumstances. We can't produce two states right now, but what we can do is create the circumstances where we preserve it as an option and we improve the realities so that we can get back to peacemaking. We're not doing any peacemaking right now. There is a kind of hopelessness that we see. And the deeper the hopelessness becomes, the harder it will be for political leaders on either side to make hard decisions.
Yeah, you wrote to The Hill recently that Biden needs a Middle East strategy to avoid a new crisis. What is the message that President Biden is sending to his allies or his friends in the Middle East, in your opinion?
I think the message they've sent is that our priorities are elsewhere, but by sending Jake Sullivan to the region, the National Security Advisor, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the message was, look, we're not walking away from the region. We understand we have stakes in the region. We understand we have commitments in the region, and we'll live up to those. But that's, again, a kind of broader focus. It isn't on the Israeli-Palestinian issue per se.
Mm-hmm. You wrote also to Bloomberg, you asked to give Israel a big bomb to deter Iran. Can you elaborate more?
Yes. I am worried that the Iranians right now are showing no signs of fear whatsoever. They enriched to 60%. It drew no reaction. They are producing uranium metal, which has no civilian purpose. The only purpose uranium metal has is to create the core of a bomb. So they're enriching to near weapons grade on the one hand. They're producing uranium metal, which is only useful for weaponization. And both of these steps drew absolutely no reaction. So they took these steps clearly not fearing a reaction. They didn't get a reaction. And so I think it's very important for them to understand that if they continue in a way that makes diplomacy impossible, they are putting at risk their entire nuclear infrastructure, which they've spent decades investing in. Now, they don't have that fear right now. We have to restore that fear. And one way to do that is to provide the Israelis the massive ordnance penetrator, lease them a bomb to carry, lease them the B-2 to carry, because they don't have a plane big enough to carry it, as a way of signaling the Iranians, if you think the military option is off the table, you better think again. And if you think that we would stop the Israelis from acting, you better think again, because in fact, we're giving them the means to act. Now, we don't want them to have to do this, and maybe we'll give them, there'll be ground rules for the use of this. But if you make diplomacy impossible, then you leave only the use of force as the other option, because we are determined to prevent you from creating a threshold nuclear weapons capability, not just a nuclear weapon, but to put themselves in a position where they're on the brink of having it if they want it. I maintain, in fact, the Supreme Leader himself years ago made a reference to this. He talked about Japan, because Japan doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but it has the means, both through enrichment and through the ability to weaponize. They have the means to create a weapon very quickly if they wanted it. Now, Japan doesn't want it because of its own history with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Iran is different. And it's clear Iran seeks to create a shield behind which it can engage in coercion. If the Iranians didn't want the option for a bomb, then why did they build this huge capacity for doing it? Why did they keep this whole nuclear archive, which shows that they, in fact, were experimenting with how to weaponize?
But you agree that Israel will not allow this program to proceed, and she have the capability to stop before they hit a nuclear base before. And what do you think about the negotiation in Vienna, the talks? Are they only waste of time?
It depends how the Iranians approach them. First of all, the Iranians have stalled until now. They're going to come back November 29th. By the way, the talks are not direct talks. They talk to the Europeans, the Russians, Chinese, but not to us.
Yeah.
The deal has to be with us, and they won't talk to us. So it's part of, again, playing for time. Moreover, if you listen to what they're saying, they're going to Vienna not to talk about their nuclear program. but to talk only about the lifting of sanctions.
Yeah. You said also schemes from the past in Beirut. Is it any surprise with Hezbollah controlling the Beirut port that it will resist any serious efforts to investigate the horrific explosion and expose and hold accountable those responsible? This is Iranian militia who are responsible of bombing and terrorism. How do you see about the deal that it doesn't include any terrorist group related to Iran?
Well, I think, look, one of the Biden administration itself wanted to get back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, because it said it wants to put the Iran nuclear program back in a box. Then it said once it had achieved that, it then wanted to negotiate a longer and stronger deal.
Mm-hmm.
The longer refers to lifting the sunset provision so that the limitations on the Iranian nuclear program don't end in the year 2030. The stronger has to deal with what's not covered by the JCPOA, ballistic missiles, which are the delivery vehicle for nuclear weapons, and Iran's aggressive, destabilizing behavior in the region. So there's a kind of almost a dividing line here between let's put the nuclear issue back in the box for now, so it gives us the time to then create limitations on ballistic missiles, but also create what in a sense are ground rules so that Iran changes its behavior in the region.
Mm.
Many people question the issue of if you get back in the JCPOA and sanctions are lifted, what incentive do the Iranians have to negotiate these other items? That's, I think, a fair question. To be fair to the administration, they understood you had to deal with these other issues, but their strategy for dealing with it was based upon getting back in the JCPOA. Now, that at this point looks very problematic. So what I was going to say is the Iranians are stalling on the talks, are clearly going to play for time, even while their program continues. Even if they say, okay, now we'll go back, they are pressing to get more for less. What I mean by that is they want the US to lift all sanctions that were imposed after the JCPOA, including sanctions completely unrelated to the nuclear program, sanctions on human rights violations, sanctions on terrorism, designations related to terrorism, having nothing to do with the nuclear program. So they want the US to lift sanctions beyond the American obligations related to the JCPOA. And in the meantime, they've completely changed the baseline of their nuclear program from what the JCPOA was supposed to produce. It was supposed to create a set of limitations. Well, now what they know from experience and knowledge and what they've developed in terms of enrichment to near weapons grade, in terms of advanced centrifuges, in terms of production of uranium metal, these are all now new baselines that the JCPOA was supposed to limit. And in fact, you can't turn the clock back on that. So what they want is basically more sanctions relief for less constraints on what they do.
Let's go talk about the Abraham Accord. The Khaleej Times said that the Abraham Accords have created the conceptual process to peace in the Middle East. Do you think that the Abraham Accords can contribute in stability in that region?
I think they can contribute greatly to dealing with some of the sources of instability. We see the Middle East is much more the victim of climate change than almost any other region, maybe except for Africa. The drought conditions, the effect on water availability, the effect on agriculture. The Abraham Accords create a possibility for cooperation with the Israelis, where the Israelis lead the world in drip irrigation, where the Israelis lead the world in terms of wastewater treatment. 90% of Israel's wastewater is reused, so it expands the availability of water. Israelis have now developed drought-resistant crops. They have they're now able to grow wheat and rice, two staples that have always been water-intensive crops. They can now grow them with a fraction of the water that was required. They have created sensors that allow you to look at the roots of plants and determine when water is required, how much, and when fertilizers. The value of this is, again, you only need to water at certain points. So all of these advances can be shared with others in the region. One other thing that the Israelis developed, there's an Israeli company called WaterGen. it takes the humidity out of the atmosphere and turns it into drinking water. Each unit provides 1,500 liters of drinking water. The UAE has cut a deal on this where they are getting machines and they'll market them throughout the world.
How do you see the cooperation with UAE in this sector or in climate change on this in this business especially?
Well, already, as I said, in the case of the water gen, there's a deal for 20 of these units to go to the UAE, but the UAE is going to market these in the rest of the Middle East and in Africa, number one. Number two, there's a collaboration between UAE companies and Israeli companies on a lot of these very issues. The head of the UAE-Israel Joint Chamber of Commerce actually happens to be an American of Arab descent, and he's described this as something that is for this moment where there's tremendous new opportunities to deal with what are the needs of countries throughout the region. And by the way, look, climate change, drought, it doesn't respect borders. You don't have to be at peace with somebody to realize you all share a certain common reality, and your people are going to need water regardless. Even Iran, we saw demonstrations in Khuzestan where people were carrying signs saying, "I'm thirsty." I see no reason not to, I would like to see the US reach out and say, look, we're prepared to help Iran with its water problems. There's no reason why we shouldn't be seeking to provide humanitarian assistance. If the Iranians turn it down, once again, you have a reminder the Iranian regime cares little about its own people.
Exactly. Mr. Ross, I have to take some question from the audience, but let me ask about what Wall Street Journal mentioned. They said that Iraq should join the Abraham Accords. Do you think that this is feasible while the country is under Iran influence?
No, I don't think it's feasible while it's under Iran's influence, but I do think it's a reminder. The Abraham Accords, in a sense, offer a pathway for the future where you have a possibility you can develop. You have the promise of dealing with what are the new problems, whether it's health-related problems, or health security, water security, food security. All these are part of a future that can be one of hope and prosperity. And then you have what the Iranians offer. The Iranians offer not an axis of resistance, but an axis of misery. So countries in the region, leaders in the region need to respond to the needs of their people. If the Iranians don't want to respond to the needs of their people, that creates their own sets of problems. If they want to change, they can change. Look, I'm not against diplomacy working with the Iranians, but the Iranians have to adjust their behavior so they don't threaten everybody else.
What is your comment on what they mention in foreign policy? They describe the summit in Erbil as a pro-Israel summit. It breaks a new ground. At great personal risk, Iraqi civil society leaders gathered to demand entry into the Abraham Accords. So this is a positive move.
I think it's a positive move. Now, obviously, there was a backlash driven mostly by the Iranians and the Shia militias. But again, it's because they want to offer a future of the region that is mired in the past. No hope, no prospects, no possibility. And they're afraid of those who offer a different vision for the future and offer a sense of possibility. Look, the fact is, I think if most Iraqis had a choice to build a better future, they would seek that.
All right. Question from the audience. Will the United States policy toward Israel change as a result of the growing Arab and Islamic population in the USA?
Very interesting question. I don't know if it'll change per se because of that, but obviously there are additional voices. There's a political process here. We have a reality of pluralism here. And everyone, we have a system that is based on the premise that the voices of people should matter. So, whatever the views are, if they have them, they should express them. And will that affect the political process? It could.
With more Jews from Arab countries assuming prominence inside Israel, how will this factor impact Israel's relationship with the Arab countries?
We're seeing the relationship that Egypt and Jordan have with Israel actually moving in a more favorable direction right now. We see the UAE with its relationship, Bahrain with its relationship. Every one of these Arab countries has the ability to influence Israeli policy because they have a relationship with Israel and Israel values the relationship. So does it mean you're going to see a complete turnaround overnight? No. But these are now, they can affect what are some of the choices that the Israelis make. I mean, take a step back. The UAE provided a very interesting model because they said, we'll fully normalize, but the price for fully normalizing is no Israeli annexation of the territory allotted to it under the Trump peace plan. What I'm suggesting in the sense that you could see the Saudis, for example, given their priority of Vision 2030, they could open a commercial trade office in Tel Aviv. Now, a politically equivalent move for Israel to take towards the Palestinians that the Saudis could ask for would be to say, stop building to the east of the security barrier, what I was referring to before. That preserves the ability to separate. That preserves a two-state outcome. That prevents a one state from emerging or drifting into a one state. So you can take the model of, and it flips on, I will put it this way, it flips on its head what was the traditional concept. And this is what the Palestinians still embrace. The Palestinians don't want any normalization with Israel until occupation ends. But Arab states aren't prepared to deny themselves what's in their national interest to wait for the Palestinians at a time when most Arab leaders look at the Palestinians and say they're incapable of acting on their own. So why should we deny ourselves what's in our interest? But the UAE model says, we will offer something to the Israelis, but we require something from the Israelis for the Palestinians. The Palestinians actually should see the benefit of that for them. They should be talking to the Arab states about it. If you're going to take these steps, here's what we'd like to see you produce from the Israelis. We, the US, should be brokering this. We should be going to the Saudis or others and say, look, here are steps you could take towards the Israelis. Let's talk about the steps you'd like the Israelis to take towards the Palestinians. If I were doing what I used to do, I would go to the Saudis and I would lay out options. I would discuss the options of what they would want from the Israelis. I would put that in my pocket, and then I'd go to the Palestinians and say, okay, we can deliver this for you, but you don't get to just receive. You also should give something. If you're going to get something, you should give something.
Yeah, the Saudis wants to go back to the Arab initiative that King Abdullah in Beirut Summit, Arab Summit in 2002 that he offered. So is it possible to go back to it?
Well, I think it's possible. I think it's possible to refine it. Look, the Arab Peace Initiative was at a very high level of generality. And it also included, for example, not just withdrawal with regard to the Palestinians, withdrawal with regard to Syria. Now, is there anybody who today would say Israel should withdraw from the Golan Heights, given what you have in Syria?
No.
I mean, there's no Israeli who would do it, but I don't even see others in the region who would say, you know, from a security standpoint, does it make sense to get off the Golan Heights when Syria is dominated by Iran, Shia militias, and the Russians? I don't think so. So there's, and one other element, the Arab Peace Initiative talked about security assurances. It didn't define any of them. This was like a slogan. Okay, take that and turn it into something. Why not have a dialogue on what kind of security assurances are you talking about?
Very interesting. I have two more questions. They said one is asking you, are you a member of the Israeli lobby as John Mearsheimer and Stefan Wall describe you in their book? What does it mean?
No, because that's a book that's largely uninformed, and the answer is no.
What were your successes and failures as a peace envoy to the Middle East?
Look, I'd say my main successes had to do with agreements between the Israelis and Palestinians, which helped to create a Palestinian Authority, which create, in a sense, the infrastructure of a state. And I obviously contributed, I think, on the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty as well.
Last question. In your book, The Missing Piece, you talked about Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem. Can this issue be solved according to the Abraham Accords?
The Abraham Accords obviously aren't focused on that per se, but I do think it creates the pathway. As I said, you can use the Abraham Accords as a model, follow the logic of what the UAE did. The UAE said, we'll normalize, but here's what we require from the Israelis on the Palestinians. Others can follow that same model. You know, for me, in the end, Jerusalem needs to be it can be a unified city, but there should be two capitals for two states.
Mm.
You know, there are more than 300,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. You know, the fact is the way they live is, if you look at the East Jerusalem neighborhoods versus the West Jerusalem neighborhoods, at least the Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, they're obviously the same. There's not the same infrastructure. You know, these are not equivalent neighborhoods in terms of the level of investment. And the fact is, if Israelis have concerns about demographics, those 300,000 Palestinians should be citizens of their state, not of Israel.
Mm.
So I look at a unified city because it can be unified in practical day-to-day terms, but there should be two capitals for two states.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your time, Danny Strauss. Really, it was an interesting interview. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Maria Maloof here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Maloof TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.